Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cal Rastiala, stepping in for Associate Director Leslie Johns, who's been doing so many of these. It's a great pleasure to be here and to discuss a really interesting and I think, well, you'll see as we get into it, very rich book by one of our colleagues, Rob Traeger, who I'm going to introduce in a second. As usual in these events, Rob, our speaker, will talk about his work for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then he and I will have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So please use the Q&A feature. You can really send those questions in starting right now if you like, or as soon as we post. We welcome those questions and we'll pose those at the very end. So without further ado, Rob Traeger, I think, is well known to many UCLA viewers, professor of political science for a long time, here at UCLA, currently at Oxford, where he is lead in the Center for Governance of AI. And this book, of course, has nothing to do with AI, but I'm sure he might field a question or two on that if you want. But this book is about the suffragist piece. And Rob, I'm going to invite you on to tell us more about it.
Thanks so much, Cal. Yes, at the moment, I'm the lead of the international governance team at the Center for the Governance of AI. So I'm so glad to be here and so glad to be able to talk about this book, which was really a kind of enjoyable book to write. We tried to pitch it to a broad audience while also being rigorous social scientists. It was written with Jocelyn Barnhart. And so I'm just very happy to be able to come and talk to you about it. So the book is about the entrance of women into the political realm over the last century, and in particular, the effect of that on relations between states. So I want to start with what everyone believes, and many of you will know about folks like Immanuel Kant and Thomas Paine and Montesquieu and others, these men from the early 19th century, and in two of those cases, a little bit earlier in the other, who thought that democracy was just going to solve so many problems. So many problems going to be solved by democracy, and one of them was war. And many of you will know about democratic peace and know about this idea, and we sort of believe that they were right. They were so prescient. They really understood what was going on. They had this idea. What was their idea? Was that there was going to be a harmony of interests between rulers and ruled. So if rulers were, engaging in some frivolous war somewhere, then the people would be able to vote them out of office, and so you wouldn't have so much war. And people think that is true. And one of the to foreshadow a little bit, they think it's true because they sort of forget about the 19th century and they go to the 20th century where it looks like it's true, but they forget about this 100 years. And actually, all of those folks who were predicting that democracy was going to work so well, they didn't live to see what these increasingly democratic countries in the 19th century were actually doing. They didn't live to see it. And I think if they had, they'd have to ask themselves some questions, but I'll come back to that. So, but that's what everybody believes, that, those liberals, the Immanuel Kants and Thomas Paines, they were right. And then to me, it's fascinating to contrast that with the suffragists. So the suffragists, they had an idea that it was actually women's suffrage that would cause a reduction in conflict around the world. And a lot of people thought that was silly, or since the suffrage movement, a lot of people have thought that was kind of silly. I don't think people really believe that is a major part of peace in the world today. So this is fascinating to me because, in fact, in many ways, it really looks like it's the suffragists who had it right, and these early liberals who maybe didn't have it so right. Um, if you follow the expansion of suffrage in the 19th century in places like England, what you see is not just a correlation between democracy and war, although you do see that a little bit. But what you also see is in these democratic countries, it's often the publics that are pushing unwilling elites into war. Because in many cases, well, first of all, these publics are participating in a kind of honor culture. And that's very clear. For instance, another conflict in the 19th century, the War of 1812, between, of course, England and the young United States. That's a case where nobody wanted this war, basically. The British tried to avoid it. They made the concessions that the Americans were asking for. But unfortunately, the boat carrying the news that they made the concessions didn't arrive until just after the Americans had declared war. And then the Americans said, well, we've already done it, so, too much trouble to go back on it. And what's amazing is this war is just a great example, but one of many, that's framed in these very honor-centric, and one might even say masculine terms. So the British envoy to Washington, D.C., who tried to avoid this war, did not want to see it happen at all. At the end of it, even he says, and this is a quote, he says that he can see that something was gained by it. What does he think was gained by it? He thinks that it was as necessary to the United States as a young country as a duel is to a young naval officer to prevent his being bullied and elbowed in society. So these are the ways that elites, to some degree, but especially publics, are often thinking about war. And over the course of the 19th century, there's sort of it's like there's a test after test after test to see if this idea of democracy is causing peace is really going to work, because democracy is expanding. So in the beginning, it really looks like it's just a few people, a few wealthy men who were part of this so-called democracy. But then that expands to more and more men over the course of the century. And so each time there's sort of like a new hope that maybe now there's enough democracy to bring peace. But it doesn't seem to work that way. So, and when we look statistically, there's actually no evidence for a male suffrage peace. So it's not looking good for those early liberals, despite their reputation. What about the women? Well, one of the things that's amazing to me, we forget today, but the suffragists they thought of themselves as fighting not for suffrage as an end in and of itself. They thought that they were fighting for policies that women, when they got the vote, would manage to enact. And one of those, in fact, most prominently, was peace. They thought women coming into office were going to bring peace, and so they had all sorts of tactics for advocating for the vote. And I want to read to you just one of their posters here, which is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but makes, I think, a serious point. So this one, the title of the poster is "Why We Oppose Votes for Men." And they say, there are 5 reasons. Number 1, because man's place is in the army. Number 2, because no really manly man wants to settle any question otherwise than by fighting about it. Number 3, because if men should adopt peaceful methods, women will no longer look up to them. Number 4, because men will lose their charm if they step out of their natural sphere and interest themselves in other matters than feats of arms, uniforms, and drums. And finally, number 5, because men are too emotional to vote. Their conduct at baseball games and political conventions shows this, while their innate tendency to appeal to force renders them particularly unfit for the task of government. So, obviously it's tongue in cheek, but this represents in some way what these women were thinking. They thought that they had a mission to affect policy. And people thought at the time of suffrage, they thought that it was a revolution. They expected women's parties to emerge and compete with men's parties and to have their own sets of issues that would be totally different. So just to revolutionize politics. And of course, once suffrage happened, none of that occurred. Women seemed to vote in the United States. They voted slightly lower rates, somewhat lower rates than men did initially. Now, of course, they voted higher rates, but initially they voted at lower rates. And there was no special women's party. They seemed to vote in similar ways to men. So people thought for 100 years that women had really no effect on policy. And it's literally only 100 years later, after so many of the women who fought for it thought that their movement was a failure because it hadn't had these effects. So now we're beginning to realize that, wait a minute, there were effects. There were effects seemingly on the size of governments, which increased. Probably women's suffrage is the reason why World War I was the first war in which spending after the war didn't return to pre-war levels as it had always previously. So there are these effects also on things that governments are doing. In some cases, maybe more spending on healthcare and on education. In particular cases, which isn't to say that women are always progressive, because that is absolutely not the case, not even the case always on average. But that appears to have happened in some cases. And what we're beginning to realize is that it rather looks like perhaps the same is true on war and peace. So when we do some statistics, and I won't give you too many statistics here, but what I will tell you is that, of course, this is all observational data. So for the social scientists out there, we can say that things really look like they're having the effects that we say that they're having, but it's hard to absolutely be sure because we can't randomize and we can't do experiments. But we do try to do fixed effects and all sorts of other fancy things. So hopefully we're able to get at the truth. And what we find is that 2 autocracies are almost 4 times as likely to fight as 2 women's suffrage democracies. But also 2 democracies, so-called democracies, without women's suffrage are more than 3 times as likely to fight as 2 democracies with women's suffrage. And this is even after we do fancy stuff to account for the effects of time and other factors. So it really looks like the suffragists were onto something, and there actually isn't great evidence for democratic peace in the absence of women's suffrage. Okay, so I'll say a couple of other things about the book and then open up to questions. So one thing is that is the question of why this is true, or why does it appear to be true, and what causes the differences in political preferences. It probably wouldn't surprise you if I tell you that 10 times as many murders are created by men as women, and that's true all over the world. So when it comes to personal aggression, we see these differences. But what about when we look at preferences, political preferences? So not just preferences about what you do, but preferences about what somebody does in your name through government. Well, it turns out that we find an extraordinarily consistent gender gap on the use of force, consistent across time and consistent across place. And we wanted to drill down into this. So we actually did a meta-analysis of all these experiments that people in the social sciences have been doing on determinants of preferences over war and peace. So we collected a large sample, and we had, I think, over 21,000 respondents in the sample. And then we do a t-test there just to check the difference between men and women on average. And you can argue about whether we should be doing this, but it was sort of fun to do because there were, I think it was 67 zeros before a non-zero in this test. So these populations of men and women are different. But this question of why they're different is such a fraught and fascinating one. That is something that I don't think we can answer. And we certainly wouldn't want to essentialize either men or women. And it certainly isn't the case that women are pacifists or anything like that. In any real world conflict, there are large percentages of men who prefer peace and large percentages of women who prefer war. So it isn't anything like that. We're really talking about averages, but even trying to understand why these averages are the way they are is fraught. We know that cultural factors play a large role. So any sort of biological determinism is not correct. But on the other hand, even in places where culture might make people more prone to support the use of force, we still find the gender gap. In other words, yes, in one place, cultural factors may mean that women are more likely to support force, but in general, in those places, we find that men are even more likely to support the use of force. And that's not to say that culture couldn't overwhelm whatever else is going on, but we do find these extraordinary patterns. So again, the question is why they are there. And as I said, I don't think we can know the answer, but I do think we also should take seriously the possibility that some biological factors, that is, some factors that are affected by experience, but organized in advance of experience. Some of those factors may also be at play. And here, in order to get at this, we can look at animal studies, and it turns out that the underlying biology of aggression is what biologists call conserved across much of the animal kingdom. That is, the underlying biology goes very far back in evolutionary time. So the triggers for aggression between species are totally different. But the biological mechanisms are the same. So that means that some of the studies of animals are quite relevant to understanding human beings. And when we look more broadly at the animal kingdom, it's much less controversial that there are these differences in aggression between male and female, and there's all sorts of interesting theory and explanation that does pretty well at predicting why that would be the case. So we think that it's important to take seriously the possibility that small hormonal differences can in effect, produce these large societal effects. That's a possibility that we think is perhaps even likely, but there's lots more to say about that. Okay, I just want to say one or two other things very quickly, and then we'll open it to questions. One thing to say is about women leaders. So given what I've told you so far, you might say, oh, what would happen if women ruled the world? Would that really be an era of peace? And the surprising answer is it doesn't look that way based on the evidence so far. It turns out, and maybe this is something we'll get into, but when we do the smartest statistical things that we can, and I have to say that statistical work was mostly done by others, it looks like women in office are maybe even more likely to get into conflict. So we can ask ourselves, why is that? If it's true, why could that be true? And I think there are a couple of different explanations that maybe you're thinking about. And probably one of them is when women and men come into office, they inhabit a certain culture, and maybe there are some pressures to look and act a certain way. Maybe women have particular pressures to look and act a certain way, and maybe that's part of what's going on. There are other possibilities. Maybe, and we know leaders are different from population on average. So maybe that's what's going on. Maybe they're so different that averages really aren't very meaningful. So this is another fascinating question that perhaps we can talk about. Yeah. So I'll just say, what if women ruled the world? Well, we don't know because everybody inhabits a culture. So there isn't really a single answer to that question. But on the other hand, it looks like if we want to have the change that some people expect and hope for, then it's not enough to have more women leaders. We're going to need to change some other things about the broader culture that they inhabit. At least that's the way it looks. Okay, I think I'll stop there, and I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rob. So super interesting thesis and kind of explication of it in the book, and a lot of issues to raise, but maybe I'll just start with one of the things that you discuss in the book. And I think for people who are maybe familiar with the democratic peace literature, which is pretty broad, there's been a lot of discussion about the idea that democracies somehow are distinct. Maybe they're more peaceful. Other people say, no, it's about a liberal peace, or even there's no peace at all. It's just a statistical artifact, an argument that you note in the book. Other people say it's about nuclear weapons. There's a lot of debate here. So I guess I would just like to hear a little bit about how you see your argument about suffrage, which honestly is really intriguing. How does that fit into all of this? And how do you distinguish yourself from some of these other strands? You address some of this, but I guess I just want to kind of press you a little bit more. And specifically, all the many critiques that have said, well, there actually really isn't a meaningful democratic peace. Do those apply to your argument?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, so I suppose, I have a little bit of, I want to critique the democratic peace myself, but I also want to defend the democratic peace. So it's a strange position I'm in. But the reason for that is because, if you just have some regression and then you kind of willy-nilly throw other things into that regression, even if they're just, let's say, randomly generated variables, if you throw enough randomly generated variables in, or even if you do one at a time, but you do it enough times one at a time, throwing in another variable, eventually you're going to find one that washes out democratic peace. or whatever result you're talking about. So I think there's a real sort of burden when it comes to these kind of prominent findings that lots of people have kind of gone after, that I think we should be sort of skeptical. And this applies to us too. We should be skeptical, kind of a new claim that says, oh yeah, I found something that explains it better because I found this thing in a regression that seems to work better. So I think everybody should be skeptical of that. And and so I would argue that we're doing something that is a bit different, and it's a bit different for one reason. I don't want to, make even too strong of a defense, though. I think people should be skeptical of everything. But the reason why I would say it's different is theory, because it's really theory that you have to find convincing. If you think the theory is sort of post hoc, that they found something that kind of worked in there and then they convinced themselves of the theory, then you should be skeptical. But if you think that maybe they even started with theory and then went to testing, then you should give a lot more credence to what they may have found. And in our case, the project actually it fully began not with any large N regressions, but with looking at experimental data. We were just looking at the data that we had seen in experiments that was showing differences between what we call self-identified binary sex. So people who check man versus woman on surveys. We were noticing these huge differences in our own data. And I hadn't really been aware. There was already, of course, a literature on that, but I hadn't really been very aware of that literature. But the differences were so large in my own data that I thought, well, I need to look at other people's data and see if it's there too. And it was there too. And then we started to think about it. We said, this really seems to relate to the democratic peace. And in many ways, it's a friendly amendment, the democratic peace, because actually Bruce Russett, in kind of maybe the most classic statement of the democratic peace, talks about this as a possible explanation. But the strange thing is that nobody did anything with it to check out whether it really was an explanation for many decades. So so I can defend democratic peace. Democratic institutions are necessary to the effects that we're finding, but the institutions themselves do not appear to be sufficient. The preferences of publics seem to matter a lot.
I mean, intuitively, that makes a lot of sense. And I like you, I think generally am inclined to believe that there is a difference with democracies. And I don't find it super fascinating to kind of break down all of these different critiques, but just because it is such a longstanding debate amongst political scientists, it's just worth raising. I guess I was curious too, I forget now whether you just said this or I read it in your book, but you do at one point sort of gesture at the famous book by Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which some viewers might be familiar with, where this was a kind of best-selling book that looks at this broader trend throughout history of our kind of move from a very violent and cruel, even sadistic kind of society. And he's got these incredible examples of things that were really common, not even in the Middle Ages, but just even a few centuries ago. And you sort of avert to some of this with regard to duels and things like that, where we were just a very violent place in a lot of ways, and the world has gotten a lot better. And we're now much more peaceful. And, of course, political scientists, being political scientists, have, attacked Pinker as some kind of interloper from psychology or whatever his ostensible field is. But, the book's pretty compelling. And so I guess I was just curious here, too, how you see your arguments about the role of women fitting in, because I could imagine, Pinker, as I recall, doesn't tell a story that's focused on women. He tells a story of a kind of general sense of Enlightenment values rippling through mostly European society as his focus. And kind of eventually we sort of wise up and we realize that torturing animals is terrible and dueling is terrible. And we start to become more peaceful. But it does seem like that also coincides with the broader emancipation of women in Western society, not just suffrage, but a
Yeah.
general move towards respecting women as equal participants in a society rather than as property of men and their families, which is the way women were treated for so long. And so I'm just curious how you see these arguments connecting or not.
Yeah, no, such a great question, and I'm so glad to get it because I had a little bit of correspondence with Steven Pinker about this, and I'm a fan of his book actually, and I know that some people in my field will be upset at me for that, but I am a fan of his book, and I think that it is, I would call it an awesome synthesis of just huge amounts of data and literature. And it does make this overarching case that I think is interesting, not airtight, but interesting. And so actually, his book is so large that he does talk about the impact of women and women's suffrage.
Sure, he does. It's like four times the size of your book or something.
I mean, yeah, exactly. It's at least. And so he says, I think, some very sensible things about women's suffrage and women's rights in general, and sort of feminization. And so I think what he's saying there is very much of a piece with what we're saying in that respect. He doesn't delve into the evidence, I don't think, in a certainly not the evidence, the interstate evidence of a suffragist piece in the way that we do. And there are others, Valerie Hudson and others who investigate what they see as the impact of women's rights on war and peace, and they tell, I think, a somewhat different story from the one that we're telling. We see these as complementary. We think that the way we read the data, it does look like women's rights in and of themselves, separately from suffrage, could well be having some effect. The story that Valerie Hudson tells, I think, is really fascinating. She says that gender models are the first models of conflict resolution. So if a child sees conflicts between their parents resolved in a certain way, then that's what they think is the model for conflict resolution. So if women have rights and those conflicts are resolved in a civilized, I guess we could say, or peaceful way, then that means that it has an effect on the broader society, which I think is just a fascinating idea and really nicely argued. We think that there's a very specific effect of suffrage, because we think that without suffrage, you just see it. You see, before suffrage, you have these social movements that can galvanize people, but they just don't have power. They don't have a claim to power. And then once there's suffrage, those same sorts of social movements have a different kind of power. And so we think, and that's what we also test statistically, looking at, using time and diet fixed effects for the wonks in the audience. That's what we try to get at statistically, this sort of change in sort of relatively small units of time, sort of before and after suffrage. And that's the effect we see.
So I'm curious about the policy implications of your argument. One obvious implication is, places that don't have suffrage for women should have it. The world would be better off if that was the case. But that seems to be sort of subsumed by a larger question about democracy. Like, it seems like that presumes democracy. And so, though I guess, kind of just to detour for a second, I wonder if your argument would also apply to just women having power, even if it were in a kind of, authoritarian selectorate kind of model of governance. But either way, if we assume, generally your focus is suffrage voting, democracy is a necessary first condition. So are your policy prescriptions just more democracy is good, and then Obviously you want women to be a part of that, but it seems like in the 21st century, I guess I'm not going to say for sure that there are no examples of democracies that lack female suffrage, but it seems like that's pretty well established now. So are your prescriptions any different than just democracy promotion as something that we maybe should be doing, or we want more democracy?
Yeah, exactly. And the first part of your question was,
well, just what I did not ask this question very well, but
you did ask two. It was a two-parter.
Two-parter. I'll back up and just say, what are your policy prescriptions, and do they differ in any way from the ones that people who are fans of democracy might propose? In other words, is there really any daylight between you and like a Larry Diamond, or I don't know, anyone who's generally been a proponent of spreading democracy for whatever reason, peace, domestically, internationally, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think there are some differences. So one of the things, for instance, that you're right, first of all, that at least in name, women's suffrage is pretty much all over the place now. But in name is not exactly the same thing as in fact. And our argument is that you in order to have the popular voice matter, you need good democratic institutions, and so in many places, even though there is a certain sort of democracy, that doesn't mean we think that women's voices can really be heard. In some cases, it may mean that no one's voices can really be heard, but in many cases, there seems to be a different. There is for sure a difference between the sexes. And I'll tell you one place, since you were asking about policy, one place where I think you really see this is in sort of post-war kind of reconstruction efforts. And so, for instance, Iraq would be an example, or Afghanistan would be a really good example. And in Iraq, it was actually quite stark, where there's some bargaining in order to constitute a democracy. And the US is heavily involved. And there's a point at which they basically choose to compromise on women's rights because they feel that they can't get everything that they want. And so they just decide that's what we're going to give up. We're going to give up a little bit on women's rights because we think that the society won't accept it. And, it's more important to have these institutions of democracy. Well, I think we're saying that if you give up on some of these things that really protect women's ability to have a voice in society, then in fact, you don't have all the benefits of democracy that you think you're going to have, in particular, the benefits of bringing about peace. And I guess, it's sort of cheap to pick the example of Iraq, but things haven't gone so well. And Afghanistan is similar, actually. There are all sorts of aspects of voting in Afghanistan, including the way that people are identified when they go to the polls, that actually make it hard for women to go to the polls and to vote something that's different from what people want them, others may want them to vote. And actually, your question, now I'm remembering a little bit the first part of your question, because there is another, I think, just really interesting aspect to this that makes voting this different thing from broader influence of women in society, and that is that the privacy of the voting booth is actually, it's something that I think we do take for granted, but it's quite extraordinary, because you go into this little place. Well, it used to be a voting booth, not always a voting booth, but there's a privacy to it, and you get to make a decision that nobody else is supposed to see. And so you're not in other areas of society, and I was talking about women leaders, for instance, you're also representing yourself to society in some way. And that is very constraining. But in a voting booth, you're not doing that. you're just voting yourself, and it doesn't require, I think it's Elena Ferrante, the Neapolitan novelist, said it at some point that that women need a form of power that doesn't require the sanction of male-dominated structures of power. And I think actually, I don't think she had voting in mind when she said that, but I think voting actually satisfies that more than really any other example of the exercise of power maybe in the world today.
Really interesting. Well, I actually have a lot more questions, but or many more questions, but I'm going to go to ones from the audience because we have quite a few and we only have a little bit of time left. So, so for the first question, is this honor culture among the public you mentioned in the 19th century still present today? And how does it manifest in modern day conflicts among men and women?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. Yeah, I mean, I wonder if that was my colleague Barry O'Neill asking the question, because he
not Barry, but Barry is of course the honor expert, and I'll just note Picker, of course, also talks quite a bit about this.
Yeah,
in that better.
Yes, he does. Yeah, so I think honor. I mean, absolutely. We sometimes it goes by different names today, but honor still certainly persists. It may persist. It persists, I'm sure, in a refracted form. I mean, we don't have the culture of dueling in the same way that we used to. So things have changed, but some of the language that's used in international politics is, I think, either code for or really just is kind of about things like reputation, which is very close to honor. And actually, we tried to parse out using experiments, very carefully crafted experiments that others had done, and we reanalyzed. We tried to parse out the different ways that men and women kind of process reputation in international politics. And so you may know that there's this idea about audience costs, that people don't like it when their politicians say make a threat and then go back down from that threat and don't follow through. They get really upset at those politicians. So that's true, but it turns out there's a really big difference in why men and women get upset. And men are upset. Men are the ones who are really clearly upset. And obviously I'm thinking about averages here, but huge majorities of men are essentially upset at the inconsistency, right? Saying one thing and not following through. Women, it's very different. Women, it looks like they're upset in many cases because of the threat in the first place, much more than the inconsistency of not following through on the threat. So,
wait a second. Wait, does that mean that women are happy then? If, again, on average,
no,
you don't follow through?
No.
Because if you thought the threat was a bad idea, then you would seem to be happy if it's not actually acted upon. But that's not the case.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking like Obama and the Red Line, that whole incident in the Middle East.
Yeah.
There's many examples in recent American history of this problem.
Yeah. So actually, the way it sort of works is that women are, on average, will tend to be happier with the sort of threat never having been made than men were, and they're not as upset as men about the being at where the threat was made and people back down. But where that nets out is that the audience cost, which is the difference between how they feel about the place where the threat was never made and the place where they back down, is actually larger for women. But it's not larger because they're more upset at the back down node. It's larger because they're happier at the stay out node. That's one thing that we found, and we also found that women were more willing to accept compromises that looked a little bit less favorable in international politics, divisions of something that's being negotiated that look a little bit less favorable. So now I've been talking for so long, I hope I've answered the question.
I think you did. I mean, I'll just make an amendment. The question was about honor culture and differences.
Oh, yeah.
You sort of slid into, relating to the question, manifesting men and women. One thing that we didn't talk about, which I guess I don't know directly relates to honor or reputation, though I could see some linkages, is risk-taking. And we know in many studies that men are bigger risk takers in all sorts of ways. And that actually explains a lot of things about gender differences as they're manifested in society. The ultimate reason for that, I guess, we'll put aside for the moment, though there's a few questions about that, which we'll get to. But I'm just curious, does risk acceptance, risk aversion sort of fit into this story as you see it?
Risk acceptance or risk aversion. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I think that, it probably does. I don't think we really have the data to parse that out, but I think that's a fascinating thing for people out there who are looking for something to think about. That is exactly a direction to go in. And there is a lot of, as you say, there are a lot of studies in exactly this sort of thing. And it's not just men who are a little bit more risk loving, I think, in these studies than women. It's also white men who are more risk loving than people of color.
Well, that could be an endowment effect of, if you have more power and resources in society, you're more likely to risk them.
That's my point, exactly the point I was making, that I don't think we always know whether these are effects of biology or effects of some class of people that have different experiences from another class of people. But yeah, I think all these things are absolutely possibilities that sort of could be explaining some of these political phenomena. Another thing that we see is men and women get angry, it seems like, about the same amount. That doesn't seem to be a difference. But then there's some things that inhibit the way that anger is manifested, including fear-based reactions, and women seem to have more on that side, on the inhibiting. So I think exactly what the underlying psychological mechanisms are is absolutely fascinating. I don't think we know exactly.
Great. So good segue to the next question, which you addressed a little bit, but obviously it's crucial to so much of what you're talking about in the book. And the question is, how much do you think this is a biological factor or a factor of how women are socialized in various societies around the world? Now, I'm going to guess that for the phenomenon, for its policy implications, for its finding, may not really matter, but it's certainly quite interesting, and I could see it mattering for some subsidiary questions. So how do you approach that, and this is a very this can be a very controversial issue to wade into.
Yeah, it's such a fraught topic, and I find it really fascinating. And as I said in the talk, I don't think that we can answer it. And there are really subtle reasons why it's hard to answer it. But I think we can sort of we can get some leverage from animal studies. Actually, first, let me say, why is it so controversial? I mean, I think that in and of itself is absolutely fascinating. Why is it so controversial? One of the reasons is that there really has been this sort of struggle that was carried on, I think, in cultural anthropology is a kind of primary site for it, but it has existed across society to really define humanity as one undivided thing, as something that doesn't really have fundamental separate groupings, and so for obvious reasons, people were throwing out some of the ridiculous racialized theories, and when they were doing that, they were arguing that the differences that had been assigned to fundamental things like race were actually about culture. That was the essence of that fight that, Zora Hurston and Margaret Mead and, all these folks were sort of engaged in. And so I think that's part of the reason why it's so controversial to say, well, wait a minute, maybe there are some underlying biological things that we should pay attention to. But we have this strange exceptionalism when we talk about human beings, because we have no trouble talking about the same thing in the animal kingdom, where we can do experiments, where we have more data, and where we actually think that the mechanisms that relate to aggression are pretty similar in many cases, even if the triggers for those things are different. I mean, this topic is such a fascinating one. I'll just say that someone who's interested in it, one of the really fascinating literatures centers around someone called Catherine Dulac, who is just a fascinating biologist at Harvard, and so she has looked at whether there are differences in brain architecture, which people thought that there would be between men and women, or male mice and female mice, because there are these spikes during development of different hormones that spike differentially for men and women. So people really thought that that was going to mean that there were fundamental differences in architecture, but it turns out there aren't. It turns out that when it comes to mice, she can make male mice be pacific in occasions when they would be like murdering the babies of a female mouse that they come across. And she can make female mice be violent in the same way that male mice normally would be. So she can go in both directions. And the way that she does that is actually just through gene expression. So the underlying biology is the same. The biology of aggression is there, and it's the same for both. This is, of course, these are mice studies, but it's it's the same for in mice, and it probably it's telling about humans too. I mean, we should be careful, of course, about generalizing from mice to humans, but it probably tells us a lot. And so really, that's another reason why we know that that biological determinism isn't right, because gene expression is determined by environmental factors also. But on the other hand, there are these gender differences in what genes are being expressed, even if the underlying biology is the same and is present in both genders. So, yeah, that, I don't think we can answer the question, but I think we should take the biological argument seriously, even if it seems a little bit scary to do so.
Great. So I think we have time for one final question, and here it is. Is there any correlation between participation of women in all decision-making positions in business versus peace and security? So in other words, are there connections between what you find in your chosen topic of peace to other settings where you may have CEOs or others who are female, kind of the leader version of your argument,
Yeah.
which is quite different than the voting version of your argument. So just how does that map on?
Yeah, well, so I'm not an expert in the business literature, but I do see some parallels, which really involve the sort of signaling. There's a literature on the signaling that women in business have to do and how complex that is, and sort of the multi-vocality of it, where they have to signal sort of toughness at the same time as they're signaling femininity and probably 9 other things too. And so I think, being a leader in our society has a set of connotations that tend to be stereotypically male traits. And so what does that mean when a woman goes into office and becomes a leader? Does that mean that she has to embody those in some way, but she can't exactly just embody those because that somehow doesn't work societally? So, these are things that are very difficult issues that you really see political leaders wrestling with, and I hear about in the business world at all. But the political leaders, to me, are so fascinating. So many women leaders have characterized themselves in male terms or outside of gender hierarchies. Indira Gandhi, for instance, called herself a biform human being, neither man nor woman, even though she so much seemed to conform to gender stereotypes in her personal life.
Rob,
So,
can I add one of the things that
yeah.
really jumped out in your book that was so interesting? This is just like a little aside, but you discussed some studies about tone and pitch of voice in members of Congress, and that women in Congress have, on average, much lower voices than American women generally. Which I thought was super fascinating. I mean, conversely, male members of Congress have higher pitch than average. So, they kind of meet in the middle. But it was just striking in the ways that, whether that's deliberate or we're selecting on those people for that reason. Obviously, that's maybe hard to disentangle, but I thought that was a really fascinating example of what you just talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. Pitch is such a fascinating thing because it's both something that is you sort of born with to a degree, but also you can affect, as for instance, Margaret Thatcher very famously did when she met Laurence of Olivier, of all people, and he gave her advice on what voice coach to go to. And it seems, I mean, at least if anecdotes are to be believed, to have really transformed her political career from, these very gendered and sexist things that people were saying about her, shrill housewife and so on, to this extremely commanding leader. And it seems like some of that had to do with transforming her own pitch. So it's just both something that you're born with and something that you have influence over. So I do think it's possible that leaders are playing to the crowd, but we don't know exactly.
Right. And of course, in business, Elizabeth Holmes would be the kind of paradigm of ridiculous voice that was clearly, aimed at somehow making her seem with more gravitas than maybe she deserved. In any event, super fascinating book. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about it. And we look forward to having you back at UCLA maybe next year.
Thanks so much, Cal. Thanks everybody out there in the ether. It was really a pleasure to come in and chat about the book. I hope you enjoyed it.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.